All right, so today we're going to be talking about tips for better edits. And the reason that I wanted to do this webinar is just because we've been doing a lot of pretty advanced editing and compositing. And some people have been saying, well, where's the basic stuff? I really want to learn a little bit more about the basics of editing. So in this video, we're going to go over a bunch of the tips that I use, or a bunch of the workflow techniques that I use on pretty much every single edit that I use inside Photo RAW. So we'll go over just simple things like keyboard shortcuts to ways that I like to use the curves filter to stylize. So it's going to be a fun little webinar. You're not going to be too in-depth or long. Just really want to give you guys a nice solid reinforcement for all the cool little tips and tricks that you can use to come out with better edits in Photo RAW. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, or if I'm going too fast or I say something that doesn't make sense, just go to the Q&A and I'll go through the Q&A in between each edit here, and we'll just talk a bit about some editing in Photo RAW. So to get started, the main thing I want to talk about right off the bat is knowing the software. Now, knowing Photo RAW in and out is going to be so much easier to edit your images that way, rather than not knowing what this button does or how to get to this area quickly. So knowing the software, it's kind of like knowing your camera. The better you know your camera in and out, the quicker you can get to your images and your camera exposure settings, and the more time you can rely on developing creative ideas and not having to worry about modifying camera settings. So it's the same thing with Photo RAW. The more you know Photo RAW in and out, the better your pictures are going to be, because you're going to spend more time on the creative side of editing and less time sitting there worrying about what button does what or how do you get to this tab really quickly. So keyboard shortcuts right off the bat, a few of them that you should know is transferring between the modules. So if you want to transfer between your modules inside of the browse module, just click on a photograph. And let's say you want to go into the edit module into the develop tab. You could just hit D on your keyboard. So now I'm inside of the develop tab, and I just hit one key on my keyboard. I didn't have to scroll over here and click anything. I just used the keyboard shortcut on my keyboard. And same thing if you want to go back into browse, just hit G. So D for develop tab. G is going to take you back into browse. I like to think of it as G for grid. So it just takes you back into your grid of photos. So if I hit G on my keyboard, now I'm back to my grid view mode for those images. Now, let's say you want to go into the effects tab. You could hit S on your keyboard. If you hit S on your keyboard, you immediately jump into the effects tab from the browse module. And you can also do that within this edit module as well. So if you wanted to transfer between the effects tab to the develop tab, you could just hit D on your keyboard. And now you're transferred between that tabs. You don't have to worry about clicking anywhere on the screen. Also, if you want to go into your local adjustments tab, it's just K on your keyboard. So a few to know right off the bat between transferring between modules would be D for develop. It's going to take you right into your develop tab. S for effects. It's going to take you into your effects tab. K is for your local adjustments tab. And then G is going to take you back into your browse module. So those are some fast ways that you can transfer between the modules when editing in Photo RAW. Now, there's also keyboard shortcuts you can use to grab tools. You can also use keyboard shortcuts to pull up different film or different view modes within Photo RAW. So whenever you're inside Photo RAW in the browse module and you want to transfer between different viewing modes, you can use different keyboards on your different shortcuts on your keyboard as well. So if I want to see my film strip view mode really quickly, I'm just going to hit F on my keyboard. And that's going to pull up my film strip view mode. So this is a very quick way, especially if you're looking for different photos and you have a ton of different images in that folder. The film strip view mode is awesome for browsing through and perusing all those images. It's just F for film strip view mode. And then G, again, is just going to take us back into that grid view area. G for grid view, F for film strip. So now let's say we want to just view the full-size image and we don't want to see the film strip. All we have to do is hit E on our keyboard. E is full view mode. Basically, it's just filling the screen with this image. And then if we want to go back, again, it's just G on our keyboard. So these are just very fast ways that you can, jump to a different view mode or jump into a different tab inside of your edit module without actually having to modify anything with your mouse. You just hit a key on your keyboard and you're immediately transferred into those areas. So I'm just going to go over to this photograph here, and I'm going to go into the develop tab. So I'm just going to hit D on my keyboard. And now I'm inside of the Develop tab here. So another few keyboard shortcuts that you definitely should be using inside of the Develop tab are when grabbing tools and such. So grabbing tools specifically, the two tools that you're probably going to grab the most often are your brushes and your gradient tools. So to grab your masking brush, let's say you've added on a filter, maybe some contrast, and let's say you don't really like how that looks. To grab your masking brush, just hit B on your keyboard. So now I have my masking brush selected. I'll just increase the brush size so that you guys can see that I have a brush selected. But now that I've grabbed that masking brush, I don't have to go over here and tap on the tool well. And if that tool isn't selected for this masking icon, it could be this tool here. And then I would have to click a couple times rather than just hitting B on my keyboard to grab that one individual tool that I know is my masking brush. And now I can just sit there and I can brush away any of the detail that I don't want. So B for masking brush. Another tool that you're going to find yourself using quite a bit as well is let's just use Sunshine here. Another tool that you're going to be using quite a bit is the masking bug and the local adjustment gradient. So if you want to grab the masking bug, just hit M on your keyboard. So M for masking bug, B for masking brush. And now I'm using this masking bug as a gradient mask, and I'll just drop this on. And now I have this gradient mask. So B for masking brush, M for masking bug. And now let's say we want to apply a local adjustment to this image. So I'm just going to hit K on my keyboard. That'll take me into my local adjustment tab. And now let's say I want to use an adjustable gradient. Well, the keyboard shortcut to using an adjustable gradient is Shift K. Shift and K. Hold down Shift and then hit K on your keyboard. And now you have your adjustable gradient for your local adjustment. So I can drop this down. I can darken up that sky layer. Just like that. So that's a fast way to grab your adjustable gradient. Now let's say you want to grab your adjustment brush. All you have to do is hit K on your keyboard. So just like going into the local adjustment tab, it's K. Once you grab your local adjustment tab here, it's going to pull up your local adjustment brush. So just to recap quickly, I know that was a ton of different keyboard shortcuts, but the main things you need to know is transferring between your modules. So D for develop, S for effects, K for local. And then if you want to go back into browse, all you have to do is hit G on your keyboard. So if you really just want to stick to the basics of it, D is going to take you into your edit module. G is going to take you back into your grid view mode. And then when you're in grid view mode, if you want to see your film strip view mode, just hit F on your keyboard. Then once you go back into the edit module to start editing your images, then you can start using different keyboard shortcuts to grab your tools. So your masking brush is B on your keyboard. Sorry, my dog was dreaming and was having a crazy dream. So B is your masking brush on your keyboard. K is your adjustment brush. Shift and K is your local adjustment gradient. And M is your masking bug. Another way that you can see all of these keyboard shortcuts is to go up here to the help and then go to so you go to so you go up to the help menu here and then ON1 Photo RAW 2020 online help, and then go into the user guide for whatever version of Photo RAW that you're using. And all the way at the bottom, all you have to do is just click on the scroller to the side, drag it all the way to the bottom, and it's the second to last page, I think. It has all of the different keyboard shortcuts available. So I'll just do that real quick. So we'll just click on ON1 Photo RAW online help. Let me change the share here. Oops, gotta show the controls. Sorry guys, I gotta just share the screen. There we go, okay. So now we're sharing this screen. And so you can see I have all of these different versions of Photo RAW and all the products that we have. So whatever version of Photo RAW that you're using, just click on the web version or the PDF if you want to download it. And then we'll just scroll again all the way to the bottom. It's the second to last page. And there we go. Here's all of the different keyboard shortcuts that you can use in Photo RAW. And I would definitely recommend going over these. They make a huge difference. Again, the more you know the software, the better you're going to get at editing your images. It's just going to be more natural. It's going to be easier. And you're going to start developing new ideas about editing that you didn't know before because you're going into different areas of the software that you hadn't explored before. So I would definitely recommend at least learning the ones that you're going to be using a bunch. You know, brush size is a big one. That's a really easy one to change. Also, grabbing your perfect brush, things like that. They're really helpful tools that you can use to just speed up your workflow and then focus more on the creative side of your editing. So keyboard shortcuts, again, just go to your ON1 Photo RAW 2020 online help. Just hide these. And then we'll share Photo RAW again. Okay. Okay, so keyboard shortcuts, that's one pretty helpful tip, especially when you're editing a ton of shots. It just, the more natural the software becomes to you, the easier it is to start editing your images in different ways. So keyboard shortcuts, definitely a helpful tool. Also, if you're not sure the keyboard shortcut to any of these tabs or anything, most of them that have keyboard shortcuts will tell you the keyboard shortcut if you hover over it. So my mouse over here is by this develop tab, but if I hover over it, oops, gotta click inside Photo RAW. Actually, let's just do it over here. So in these panes, it was when you hover over it would show you the keyboard shortcut, but maybe it doesn't do that anymore. But it definitely does it over here on the tool. So if I hover over my crop tool, come on, Photo RAW. I don't know why it's not. On your version of Photo RAW, I think it's because I'm using Zoom and I'm using two different screens right here. But if you hover over any of these tools, there we go. So if you hover over the tool, it'll tell you the keyboard shortcut and also a little description of what that tool does. So it says text tool, parentheses T. So I just hit T on my keyboard and then I got my text tool. If I want to grab the crop tool, it's just C on my keyboard. So C for crop tool. And just hovering over these and just getting a better idea about how to grab them quickly, it'll just speed up the process of editing and you'll have a much better edit. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the histogram real quick. The histogram is a very helpful tool in photography, especially if you're not sure what your exposure looks like. So in this area right here, this is our histogram, and this is just found in this levels tab. And our histogram is basically a grid or a guide to showing us all of the different exposures and tonalities within our shot. So over here on the far left, that's our shadows. That's the darkest areas within our shot. The blacks and the shadows they live over here to the left. And then as we move to the right, then we start getting our midtones. So right in the middle here, we have our midtones. And then as we move to the right more, we just have our highlights and then we have our whites. So it just moves like a tone curve, basically. We have our darkest point to the left, and then as we move to the right, it just brightens up. And all these little spikes in here, these little spikes of white and color, that's just telling us that these are tonalities that are peaking and spiking, not peaking, that are just spiking in these areas. So we have quite a bit of midtones in this area, and I can see that with all of these middle grays within the shot. I can also see that we have a lot of whites, well, not whites, but more highlights within the shot because we have this big spike in our highlight area on our histogram. The one thing we don't have, however, is pretty much any shadow tones. So let me jump out of that develop or that local adjustment, go to my develop tab real quick. And now let's keep an eye on our histogram here. And I'm just gonna pull back on my shadow tones. Do you see how I move that shadow tone to the right? And it immediately pulls these midtones over near these shadowy tones on our histogram. That's because I'm incorporating more shadow tones within the shot. And if I lower my exposure, it'll just keep doing that same thing. You see how it removed all of those bright tones or those bright peaks in our histogram, and it put them over here because now we have a lot more shadow tones within our image, and we can see that with this big spike over there on our histogram. So if I pull up on my whites now, let's just see what it does to our whites. Now I have a huge spike in my whites because I've pulled up on that white slider. Now, when it comes to the histogram, typically a perfect exposure, which is incredibly hard to get, I mean, almost impossible, the perfect exposure would be just a nice mound, kind of, you know, you have some shadow tones and some shadow detail, but it's not covered the entire image. And then you have a little bit of mid-tone detail, but you don't have any true white in your image. So it's typically supposed, I mean, it never really looks like a mound, and there's so many different things that go into an exposure that it could look like an awesome image and just be spiked one way. But the main rule about it is it should just look like a little kind of hump right there, right in the middle, a little mound in your histogram. And that just means your midtones are perfectly exposed, they take up the majority of the shot, and then you have an even little fall off between your whites and your shadow tones. But again, it doesn't have to look like that. It rarely ever looks like that, and you could get an amazing photo with this as a histogram. It just depends on the scene. So a histogram is a very helpful tool when you're editing images, especially if you have an image and you're not sure if it's exposed or not. Well, let's say it's all the way down here and you have this huge spike right there, but there's no mid-tone tonalities or highlight tonalities in there, then it's probably an underexposed shot. The more you start pulling this large area of white, once you start pulling that to the right and more into these areas of highlights and midtones, that's when you're going to be seeing a lot brighter of an exposure. But again, it doesn't have to be a perfect exposure every time. There's so many different variations of this histogram. But let's talk about the colors first as well. So I'm just going to double click this exposure, take it back. So if we're looking at the RGB values in here and the color tones in here, we see we have blue, we have some green, yellow, red. I shouldn't say RGBs because we have a ton of different colors in here. But these color spikes are just telling us where these colors are located within those tonalities. So if I look at the blue here, I can see I have a lot more blue in my shadow tones than I do in my highlights. I mean, I do have a ton of blue in these highlights, and it's peaking over here, but you can see this big peak of blue here where my midtones kind of meet my shadows, and that's from this area in here, and also the blues in these trees and such. So if we went down to my temperature and I warmed this image up, see how I'm replacing those blues in my highlights for warm tones? And that's because I'm incorporating more warmth into the image. So I'm seeing that I have a lot more yellow and a lot more red now, and that's just because I brought my temperature up. And if I go back, now I have those blues within the highlights and in those true whites within the shot. So that's just a great way to look at which color tones or which color values take up certain tones, and also just to see what your exposure is looking like, especially if you're modifying something on a screen where it's a bit dark, or I don't know, for whatever reason you can't have your brightness up all the way. This will give you a better idea of what your exposure truly looks like. Okay, so let me see if there's any questions before I move on to the next just few steps here. Are there any questions? I don't see any so far, so I'll just keep going. Okay, so that. Okay, so and then the next thing I wanted to talk about for better edits, and these again are just really quick, simple things that I would consider using whenever I'm editing, just because they've been kind of a staple for me when I've been editing, and they seem to work well for just getting the best exposure and the best look possible out of your image. So I'm going to hit D on my keyboard with this image, and that's going to take this image into the Develop tab. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is our camera profiles here. Now, the only time you're going to see these camera profiles is if you're shooting in RAW. And I wouldn't say shoot in RAW all the time, but RAW just gives you a lot more flexibility when it comes to editing and pulling out deep, dark details. So if you're photographing nighttime images or darker photographs where you need a little bit more power within your shadow tones, I would definitely recommend shooting in RAW. It'll give you that little bit extra breathing room with these sliders. So it helps out a lot. So if you're shooting in RAW, you get these camera profiles, and I love using these camera profiles just to give me a quick idea of what I'm going to do to the shot. For this image, I honestly haven't edited it yet, and I don't know what I want to do with this photograph. But the one thing I know that I like to do whenever I don't know what I'm going to do is I just go to my camera profile, and I'll just hover through these, and I'll see what they do. Because they do set a really nice foundational look on your shot. So ON1 landscape, see how that's just cleared out a lot of that fade and that fog and added in all these bright tones. It just, made it pop a bit. It's added in some contrast, and it's making these bright lights pop out. And that may be the look that I'm going for. So right then and there, I've already, fixed one thing about my image just by using that one camera profile. And then let's say, I don't like that one. It's a little bit too dark. I could go to ON1 Portrait. And ON1 Portrait is going to alleviate some of the contrast on your image. It's going to open things up a bit. But that may be a little too dark even for my standards for this photo. So I might go down to ON1 Vivid, which is going to be really popping up the colors. So I'll just go to ON1 Neutral. And I really love ON1 Neutral, or even camera neutral within your shot, because ON1 Neutral and the camera neutral really just open things up for your nighttime images. They're a really great camera profile for shots like this where you just need to open up your darker tones. So I can already see, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, I can see a lot more of these tones in here just right off the bat. So I don't have to do that little extra now with my contrast or whatever else it is, because I've already done that with my camera profile here. So with this photo, I could just head down to my shadow tones a little bit. I'll add in a little bit of contrast and maybe just warm it up. And immediately, we have a much better looking photograph. And all I did was I chose an ON1 Neutral camera profile. And so if we go back to standard, see how much that helps to just bring out those darker tones. And it really provides a nice, solid, clean slate for your image, and you can start working with it and modifying it and creating your own look. So the camera profile is awesome for just giving you ideas and just making the creative inspiration a little bit easier. Okay, so let's see what else I had on the docket. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind when you're editing is looking out for true white and true black within your image. And this was something that I had no idea about until I started working at ON1. But I knew about the clipping warnings, but I never really used them just because I thought, oh, I'll see it with my eyes. But sometimes you may not see any, or sometimes you may be looking at a photograph and you'll see a bunch of contrast and you'll think, wow, that's a really dark photograph and there's not a whole lot of true black in there or any at all. And then you hold down your J key and there's no true black in the image, and you need to add in a little bit because you've just been staring at that image for so long that you thought there was contrast when there wasn't. So holding down your J key to see your clipping warnings is a really great technique for just, again, a little bit of a reinforcement of the exposure and the overall look of your image. So with this image, I'm just gonna reset everything. So if I hold down my J key, I can see that I have true white in all of these lines in here. And now, true white within like a city or something like that is not a big deal because these are really bright lights. And if you dim these down, so if I hold down my J key and I dim this down all the way, they'd look kind of flat and weird. So a little bit of true white, especially within city lights or light trails in your shot, is not a huge deal. But the thing that does help is giving it a little bit of true black. So if I hold down my J key, I'm gonna use that camera profile again, that ON1 Neutral. And you can see it doesn't do anything to these true whites, it just opens up the shadow tones. And now that I've opened up my shadow tones, I can see I have a little bit of true black still in this area right there. But it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of contrast within the scene. So let's add in a little bit of true black in these areas with just our contrast slider. So I'm, again, holding down my J key, and I'm just gonna pull up on my contrast slider. And that's quite a bit. So we probably don't need that much on the shot. We maybe just need that much. So 34, if I zoom in here to this other area, I can see I have just a little bit more true black in there. Maybe that's probably good. We want about maybe like 8% of this image full of true black. But now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it does tighten things up a bit, and it does remove some of that fog and haze back there. And now, again, I can just pull up on my shadow tones. And then we might need to add in a little bit more true black with that contrast. There we go. So by using my clipping warnings, I'm just monitoring that true black and that contrast within my shot. And so that when I pulled up on the contrast, I could see that that area had enough on it so that it looked fine enough for me to go down to my shadow tones. But then when I pull up on my shadow tones, I removed some of that contrast, so I needed to add in a little bit more into the shot. So holding down your J key when you're modifying your tone and color can be really helpful, especially in nighttime photographs or photographs where you're not sure if it needs contrast or it needs to be less exposed, or you need to pull away some highlights or whatever it is. The J key on your keyboard showing your clipping warnings is really helpful. And I mean, I know I was saying with city lights in here and having a little bit of true white in them isn't a big deal, but if you're having a sunset or something like that and you have a really blown out area, you could probably pull that back quite a bit and remove most of that blown out whiteness in there, because you don't really want a whole bunch of true white in a big blown out sky. But in these little, you know, city lights in here and light trails, it's not the worst thing to have because it looks pretty natural. You know, these are really bright lights and this was taken at a really dark time. So let's see what else we got here. All right. Next thing I wanted to talk about, we'll go to a different image. Let's say this probably would be a good image. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was knowing your sliders. And this just goes back to knowing Photo RAW and knowing the software. And if you're comfortable at photo editing and you've been photo editing for a long time, you probably are really, really comfortable knowing these different sliders in here. But if you're not, and you just kind of pull up on things until it gives you a look, this is going to help you when you're editing. Knowing your sliders is such a key thing in photography, because then you won't have to be guessing. You won't have to pull up on a slider and back and forth to see what it does. You're going to know exactly what that slider does before you even use it. So let's just go over the basic sliders real quick. I'm not going to go over, well, we'll just super quickly, I'll go over exposure. So exposure inside of the tone and color is just brightening up everything on your image. It's not going to take into account your different tonalities. It's not going to take into account your contrast. It's going to literally pump in exposure, brightness into everything in your shot. So if I pull up on my exposure slider, it's brightening up the entire scene. It's not taking into account any of the different tonalities in here. It's just pulling up on the brightness everywhere. So when I would use the exposure slider, I would use it in times where my photo is a little bit underexposed, or I wish it was a little bit brighter of a shot entirely. With a photo like this, I don't think it needs to be modified at all, because if I do pull up on this exposure, then I'm losing a lot of that detail in his shirt and it just looks bad. Then we have our contrast slider. So our contrast slider is going to incorporate white and black tones into the image, and that's going to create contrast. It's going to make things pop out of the scene. So if I pull up on my contrast here, you can see how it's making things pop. It's making things lively. It's separating him from the background here. We just have contrast. We're creating contrast within the scene by incorporating white and black tones. So the contrast slider, again, just allows for that detail and that pop and just makes things pop. I need to stop saying pop, but it'll make your photo have some detail. The contrast slider is really great for that. The other thing you can use your contrast slider for, and I've shown this in many a video, and I learned this from Frank Salas, actually, who's an amazing wedding photographer, but he goes in here to these dark images and he pulls back on the contrast all the way, or until he sees the tones that he likes. And then what he does is he holds down his J key so that he can see his clipping warnings, and then he heads down to his black slider, which we'll talk about in a second. But he pulls back on his black slider, and that's what incorporates the contrast within the shot. So that's another method that you can use. I'll just reset that. So you don't have to use your contrast slider just to incorporate contrast. You can use it to remove it as well and pull out on those darker areas within your shot. Then we have our highlight slider. So if we want to recover any highlight detail, let's say we have a blown out area. Actually, let's just go back to that other image because it has some blown out whites. So let's say we want to recover these highlights. I'll just hold down the J key on my keyboard and I'll pull back on my highlight slider. Now if we zoom in here, you can see it's just alleviating the bright highlights in the shot. But keep in mind that the highlights aren't as bright as the whites. So the whites are going to be true white. They're brighter than your highlights. So if I pull back on my whites here, see how it removes the white immediately. It takes away all of the white. So now we have these weird black and gray dots in there. So the highlight slider isn't as bright as your white slider. The white slider is a stronger slider than your highlight slider. But you can see that the highlight slider, again, just really great at alleviating those bright highlight tones. And if you want a little more highlights, pull up on this thing and it'll give more highlights or more of that bright light within your shot. And then we have, so I'll just go to this shot again because this has more midtones. And then we have our midtone slider. So the midtone slider is your midtone slider is your middle grays within the image. So your skin tones. Your skin tones within the shot would be these middle grays within the cow. There's some midtones within this, whatever he's using to lead the cows through the field here. And then we have all these midtones within these trees. And this photo is actually filled with midtones, as we can see with this little hump in our midtones on the shot. So if I pull up on my midtones, you can see it's not brightening up everything in the shot. It's just brightening up my midtones. And that's the difference between your midtone slider and your exposure slider, is that your midtone slider will only pull up on those middle grays. It's not going to focus any energy on everything. It's just going to focus on these middle grays that we were talking about earlier. So again, pull up on the midtones. It's going to pull up on those middle grays. You can also use it to add in some contrast to those middle grays as well. A lot of people, they'll only pull up on sliders. Try pulling back on sliders and see what it does. If you pull back on your midtones here all the way, and I give it just a little bit of a white boost, and now I have like a kind of a stylistic, almost cinematic look in this shot versus just having the regular, perfectly exposed image. So if the only thing you do with sliders is pull up on them, try pulling back on them and just see how you can incorporate a different look onto your image. Midtones, middle grays, midtones are skin tones. So think about midtones as your middle grays and your skin tones in the image, and that's what that slider is modifying. Then we have our shadows, which we talked a little bit about in this photo. It's a pretty good photo for shadow modification. But again, your shadows are just those darker tones, those really dark, rich tones in your image. So if I pull up on these, you can see it's not brightening the midtones or all of the exposure. It's only pulling up on those shadow tones. Now, one thing I would recommend whenever you're pulling up on your shadow tones is keep your contrast in check as well. Whenever you pull up, even on your midtones as well, whenever you pull up on any of these two sliders, these shadows and midtones, keep an eye out for your contrast because you're removing contrast immediately with these two sliders. Anytime you pull up on the midtones, you're removing some of the white and some of those middle grays from your shot, and that in turn is removing contrast. Pulling up on the shadows, you're removing a lot of that dark area in your contrast. So whenever you're using these two sliders, always just think, well, do I need more contrast? If you don't, it's not a big deal, but you may need a little more contrast in your shot after pulling up on these. So if I pull up on my midtones a bit like that, my shadows, the image is a little bit flat. So now let's head up to our contrast and just we'll incorporate more of that contrast back in there. So I'll hold down my J key. And that looks pretty good, about 38. So now if we just double tap the contrast to turn it off, you can see it helps a lot. It really takes away a lot of this fade in the sky and just helps it out. So whenever you're pulling up on your midtones or your shadow tones, always keep an eye out for your contrast. So again, shadow tones are just the dark shadowy tones within your shot. And like we did with that last shot, this photograph, if we pull back on the shadow tones, it kind of looks nice once we pull back on the shadow tones with this image especially. It moodies things up, it darkens these areas, and it just adds in a little bit of contrast to those shadow tones. So again, pulling back on sliders isn't a bad thing. If you're used to pulling up on them, try removing some of the tones in the shot and just see what it does. You never know. That's basically all I do in Photo RAW is I just play and practice and try stuff out. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't, but when it does, you can find some really awesome little hidden tips and tricks in there. So let's go on to, okay, so we got three things. We got renaming layers, filters, we got local adjustments, and then we got the curves filter. So let's zoom through these here. So renaming things. This can be very helpful. If you have a lot of different things on your shot, especially different filters and different local adjustments, or you're working with multiple layers, if you have a bunch of different layers on your shot, learn to rename the things. If you're, let's say you go in here and we'll rename this layer real quick. So if you have multiple layers or you want to rename a layer, just double click it and we'll rename it image. So now we've renamed this image. So, I mean, you can rename it whatever you want. But now let's say we've added a bunch of filters. We got our curves, then we got maybe a LUT, and then we got this, I don't know, sunshine filter, but it's strong, but we're only applying it to a luminosity mask. Anyway, let's say we got multiple different filters going on here. Try renaming them and staying organized. And that way, when you go back and you have to re-edit or you need to modify or adjust something, you can just immediately pick out what you were doing to the shot, especially if you have multiple masks on the shot. So for this curves, I could name this cinematic look, because I usually use curves to do a cinematic vibe, and then I could use the LUTs for color, or we could do like color style, and then we could use sunshine for bright light, something like that. So now that we know that this has a cinematic look, this is for my color style, and this is modifying the bright light within my shot. And you can do that with local adjustments as well. So we can rename this sky. We can use this to darken our sky real quick. Like that. Maybe feather it. And then we'll just use this off our shadow tones and some skin tones. So that's our sky layer. And then let's say we add another one. We'll add, we'll just do detail, and then we'll pop the vibrance. And this one is just for, you know, maybe these cows. So this is just painting on the light in these cows, you know? So that's probably way too much, obviously, but if we just pull this back, cool that down a little bit maybe. So now we have this adjustment just applied to these cows, so we can rename this cow color or something. So that just, it's easier to go back in and start seeing what we were doing to the image, especially if you're a person that likes to go back and readjust images all the time. Because Photo RAW is all non-destructive, we can always go back and remodify these things if we like. So that's a really helpful way to just stay organized. And if you're using multiple layers, I would definitely recommend using the renaming. Rename your multiple layers to stay organized. It will save you in the end, especially if you have 5 different layers in here and they're all the same name or just weird names with numbers. It's going to get confusing. So definitely recommend renaming things to stay organized. Okay. And then our last couple tips here, which I use on pretty much every single edit ever. So again, I'm using the actually I might have clicked on the browse button, but I'm trying to use the keyboard shortcuts as much as I can in this webinar. I've probably been using my mouse. Okay, so we'll reset this. I think I was modifying it earlier. Nope, we're good. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about are local adjustments. I think local adjustments are key to, I mean, not every single awesome edit, but they are a very valuable tool when it comes to specifically modifying areas on your shot. So with this shot, I'm just going to go into my Develop tab. I should be transferring between the things, keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to go down to my camera profile. I'm just going to choose ON1 Neutral, just to neutralize things. And I also want to brighten this sky area up a bit. But I want to darken down this foreground area. I want to add in a little bit of color and darken this up a bit. So I'm going to hit K on my keyboard. That's going to go into my local adjustment tab. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and K to grab my adjustable gradient. And then I'll just drop this down on the horizon line. I'll line this up with the horizon line there. That looks pretty good, just like that. So if I turn this off and on now, it does a great job of just darkening this area. But the one thing that you can do with local adjustments is you can modify any of these different tonalities in here. So with this local adjustment layer, I probably should go back a bit. If you're not familiar with local adjustments, what they do is they allow you to modify specific areas on your image. When you add a local adjustment layer, it's not doing anything right off the bat. You first have to selectively apply it with a masking bug or your masking brush. So that's what I did. I used my masking, or my adjustable gradient rather, they're the same thing. but I use my adjustable gradient to place this on the horizon line here and then darken my foreground. Now with the local adjustment, I can modify any of these different settings in here. So I'm gonna actually pull back on my color, and that's gonna add a nice soft blue within my foreground. So now if I turn this local adjustment off and on, I think that's already an interesting foreground, and we haven't done anything but add a local adjustment and I think I did a camera profile. But that's two things on the shot that I've done, and it already looks like a more interesting image. And in these local adjustments, if you don't like how dark something is, I wouldn't recommend going up to your exposure and just pulling that back up. Leave your exposure at -1. So if we have this at darken, whoops. So if we have this at darken and we have a little blue color temperature to it, one thing we can do rather than just going up to our exposure and pulling this back up is if you want to protect specific tones within your local adjustment, just add them into your adjustment layer. So if I want to protect these whites in here, I'm just going to pull up on the whites a little bit so that it makes sure I have that little bit of pop in there so that it doesn't look like it's just muddying up and darkening up this entire foreground area. And I could even remove a little bit of contrast, maybe add in a mid-tone boost, but I still have that awesome darkening local adjustment layer on my scene. So other than going into your adjustment and just, if you think it's too dark and pulling up on your exposure, go into the sliders or the tones, the specific tones that you want to protect, and start modifying those first rather than just pulling up on your exposure. I think it'll help you to learn the sliders for one, and also just really fine tune your local adjustment layers, because I rarely go up here to my darken and I pull up on my exposure. I rather go down here into these tones and I'll start protecting them. And then if it's a little bit too strong, that's when I start modifying my opacity slider. So local adjustments, awesome way for protecting certain areas on your shot, darkening things down a bit. And we can also do this with the sky area as well. So if I wanted to add, so we'll just rename this foreground. We'll add another adjustment, and we'll just name this, I don't know, vibrance. Maybe make it pop with some color. We'll increase the saturation, and then we'll maybe, I don't know if it's gonna look good warm, but we'll see what it looks like. So hold down Shift K on my keyboard, and this time I'm gonna head up to my preset. I'm gonna choose linear bottom, and then I'll just drop this down, and it is a little, actually it doesn't look too horrible, kind of warm like that. And I'll just make sure it's a little bit feathered so it brings a little bit of that warmth down into my foreground. And we'll rename this sky. So we have our sky color layer here, and then we have our foreground. So if I turn off my sky layer, I actually really enjoy that powerful warm light. And the one thing we need to do though is we need to either feather a little bit more of that warmth down into this foreground, because it does not really match. So let's just head back to our temperature and we'll remove some of that warm or that cool color. I think that looks good just like that. Now we'll increase the saturation and the vibrance. There we go. So now we have that matching warm color on the bottom, and then we get that blue coming at the bottom, or the matching warm color from the sky coming in here, but we still get that nice blue on our foreground. So all we did in here was we changed our camera profile and we added 2 local adjustment layers, and we have this. So you don't have to do a whole lot within these local adjustments, but they can just add just enough to make things a little bit more interesting and make things pop a bit more.